Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kari Bingen. I'm the director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS, and I'm very excited about today's event. You know, if you think about the last decade in space, it has been such a dynamic period. We've seen historic milestones, and this is all happening in the context of major geopolitical changes. So it's with that backdrop that I'm pleased to welcome Christian Davenport, staff writer, book author multiple times over on space issues, but he is the author of a new book called Rocket Dreams, Musk, Bezos, and the Inside Story of the New Trillion-Dollar Space Race. And this is a follow-on to a book you did a couple of years ago called Space Barons. You know, a central theme of this book, and we'll unpack this, is competition and the new space race. A race between nations and companies and billionaires, and how they shaped each administration's policies and approaches to space exploration and security. I'm also very excited because, well, Chris documented and had some great insights on what was happening within our space ecosystem. He'll be joined later in the discussion by Scott Pace and Chirag Parikh, who both served as executive directors of the National Space Council. And we'll be able to peek behind the curtain a bit, pairing what a journalist sees with what was actually happening in the sausage making. So for all of you joining us in person here and online, we want to take your questions, so please submit those. There's a QR code here. There's a tab on the website. So go ahead and submit those questions and we'll get to them. So Chris, great to have you. Thanks for joining us. You know, I'm going to start you off. Why did you feel the need to write another book or a sequel to Space Barons?
First, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to CSIS. You are often one of the first calls when I'm writing these stories during my day job and help me frame my thinking. And I think you just are an enormous asset to reporters like me and the public at large. So it's a real treat to be here. So yeah, you mentioned I wrote this book called The Space Barons, which came out in 2018, and I thought maybe at some point there would be enough material for another book, maybe. And just so much happened between, you know, just in the 5 years or 7 years afterwards. It was a little bit mind-blowing. Those of us in the Space Press Corps, I think, you know, it's almost like being on a permanent presidential campaign. The amount of news was just unrelenting. And I really do think that we are living through a historic era where things in space are moving so fast and are at an inflection point that we are going to look back at this time, you know, 30, 40, 50 years from now as a historic moment. And it really, I think, transcended what I could do as my day job at the Washington Post to feel like, you know, we should write a bigger history of this. I wanted to be able to record it. So, I mean, that's, and you know, I'm already looking at all the things that have happened since last Tuesday when this book came out and going forward and thinking like, oh, is there another book? What's the next one going to be? Yeah.
You took my last question, but we'll come back to that. I thought it might be useful. First, we'll start broad and then we'll go into specific events that you chronicle in the book. But, you know, if there were maybe two events that you chronicled that really stood out to you in the period in which you cover, which is largely, I think, 2016 to the present day, what are those, you know, 2 to 3 events, and why did they stick out to you?
Well, one thing I'll start with, which may be something of a surprise because you see like the pictures of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk on the cover, and they're the quote-unquote space barons. But in this book, I had a really good series of editors actually, and pushed me to sort of broaden the scope beyond just the space barons. You know, that there's, you know, lots of great stories about them, really juicy stuff, but to take a broader look at some of the geopolitical aspects of space, and particularly what China's doing in space and how fast they're moving, which required a lot more research and a lot more work on my part, but I think it was worth it. And you know, digging into what they're doing, I thought was surprising and revelatory. Maybe not to you because you follow this every day, but to me, the story that I tell in the book that I think symbolizes their ambitions and where we are in the space race with China today is the fact that of all of the American flags planted on the moon during the Apollo era, none of them are around. I mean, in fact, the flag where you have that famous picture of Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag on the lunar surface, he writes in his memoir that when he and Neil Armstrong lifted off from the lunar surface, the thrust from their vehicle actually knocked that flag over. But despite that, the radiation environment, the harsh environment of space and being on the moon have rendered them essentially to tatter. So when China went to the moon for I think it was on their second moon landing, they made a flag out of composite materials that they had spent years developing to withstand the harsh environment of space, which I thought was symbolic. The next flag from their far side sample return mission, and again, just going to the far side, nobody had done that. Bringing back samples, I think, is illustrative of their capabilities. They brought a flag that was essentially, could have been made from the resources of the moon, which symbolizes this idea that when we go to explore now, you want to be able to use the resources where you are, just like settlers going west had, deer to hunt, water to drink, trees to build shelter. So what they did was they took a basalt rock, volcanic rock from Earth, but of course it's plentiful on the moon, brought it to about 3,700 degrees Fahrenheit, and was able to extract from this lava these threads that were 1/3 the diameter of a human hair and weave a flag out of that. And that, to me, I think, sort of symbolized when we talk about where we are today and what their ambitions are. I think I can think of nothing else that tells that story better.
Wow. Well, and your book starts in the 2016 timeframe, and I want to read a passage from it because I thought it was an interesting way to set the stage where, quote, "The United States had begun to cede its dominance in space, and NASA was starting to look like a tired and bloated bureaucracy that did not at all resemble the agency that had put men on the moon within a decade of receiving the charge," end quote. So you've been covering space and this ecosystem for a long time. What is your reflection of NASA and this evolution and path that they've been on?
Yeah, when the last book came out, and I would talk to people because I think people have some knowledge of space, but sort of this deeper level. I think large parts of the American public didn't realize that after the space shuttle retired in 2011, the United States government for a decade almost did not have the ability to fly U.S. astronauts. In fact, obviously, we were sending them over, to Russia, and Russia was flying our astronauts at something like $85 million a seat. And NASA does, let's be clear, they do a lot of amazing things, the Webb telescope, the Perseverance rover on Mars, all of these things. But so much of, I think, NASA's place in the zeitgeist and popular culture is human spaceflight, right? That's the connection. And when you're not flying people, I think that really hurts you. And I also think that NASA had been chastened by the two space shuttle disasters. Challenger and Columbia had, as of course they should have, a huge effect on the culture of the agency. I think those really reverberated in profound ways and set the course for years to come about sort of the culture at NASA. But now we're at this stage where, of course, they're outsourcing so many vital missions to the private sector. And you see this going across multiple administrations, from George W. Bush to Obama, and now having this paradigm where we outsource cargo and crew flights to the International Space Station, astronaut flights to the International Space Station, now taking that paradigm and extending it to the moon under the Artemis program, which creates all sorts of opportunities, but really all sorts of challenges as well.
And you hit throughout the book on this clash of cultures and just a very different approach that the commercial sector brings to all of those missions. I'm thinking of a certain chapter in your book where you talked about how SpaceX was building a docking segment so that it could dock with the International Space Station. But talk about how some of those clashes of culture and approaches between commercial sector and NASA manifested.
Yeah, no, and that docking system story is one of my favorite in the book. It was what we chose to excerpt in the Washington Post. And I think it gets to the culture of SpaceX and how they do things differently. And to me, it's illustrative of, like, if you want to know how SpaceX is dominated, this story, I think, tells it. And that's, they were competing for the contract commercial crew contract to fly NASA astronauts. They're going up against Boeing. And at the time, like, Boeing was clearly the favorite. SpaceX was still sort of an up-and-comer, not as well known, not as established as it was today. NASA went to SpaceX and said, we've developed this docking system that we want you to use, and we trust it. It's robust. We developed it. A lot of time, energy, resources going into it. We know it works. By the way, it's our space station that you're going to be docking to. It's like a $100 billion national asset, so please use our docking system. And SpaceX took a look at it. Actually, it was a young engineer who'd only been at SpaceX a few months, but he knew that his job wasn't just to take it without questions. His job was to analyze it, and he looked at it and said, it's really heavy. There are a lot of software that's required for it. It has these 6 arms that have to reach into the docking port. Each one of those has its own motor. Each is a single point of failure. If one of them goes wrong, you're in trouble. He went out and designed something much simpler, using springs or shocks from a mountain bike, right? And got some parts from like an industrial Home Depot and built it. And his boss was like, yeah, this is great. Let's just go show Elon. And the young engineer, his name is Jarrett Matthews, is like, you mean like now? You should show him this now? And they're like, yeah. And they wheel it over to Elon's cubicle, and he studies it, asks some questions, like, yeah, let's do this. And now, again, this young engineer is in the position of having to go back and tell NASA, yeah, that docking system that you really, really want us to use, we're not going to use it. And oh, by the way, they hadn't won the contract yet. So now he's got to defend, almost like defending a PhD thesis, to the NASA selection board to say, like, thank you, but here's why ours is better. And in the end, it worked out, but it just shows the enormous gamble they took and their steadfast belief in trying to do better and simpler and faster.
Well, and you can understand NASA trying to balance risk. To your earlier point, I mean, they did have Challenger and Columbia that still weighed on them. They had been successful in taking that certain approach to date. So how do you think NASA reconciled, their traditional modus operandi with what some of these newcomers were bringing in?
So I think at the time, and I actually remember talking to Elon about this, that there were, even earlier on, people within NASA who were saying, let's do things differently. Let's look to the private sector. Yes, we've had a monopoly on space for decades, but it doesn't always have to be that way. Other people, the commercial sector, might have better ideas. And I think they were in the minority. And over time, as the commercial sector has grown and matured and had a track record of some success, they've won more people over. I think there's still that tension today, but I think there are more people in there who are accepting of it.
Well, and there's another story that you highlight on flying by touchscreen. So I'll ask you to expand upon that. But there's also trust that has to be built between these hotshot companies and different ways of how they're approaching these problems with, ultimately you are putting, human lives are being put in your hands.
Right, so with this, they had won the contract, or actually even before, leading up to the contract, and Elon wanted to have touchscreens. There are a few like analog buttons and switches, but there was not like a real stick, which is what they're used to in fighter jets and what, the space shuttle had. And there's a scene in the book where one of the first simulations, and the astronauts come down to test out flying the spacecraft and trying to dock the spacecraft with the International Space Station using the touchscreens. And all of them initially were like, where's the stick? And like, this is ridiculous. I don't want to fly by swipe. I don't want to fly using software. And compounding the problem was the fact that, this was like iPhone 1.0. There were still a lot of glitches in it. And every single one of the astronauts crashed, except for one, Doug Hurley. But even him, he really struggled. And a lot of the astronauts went to Garrett Reisman, who was a former NASA astronaut, then working at SpaceX, and were like, dude, it's not working. You need to scrap this. But over time, the SpaceX engineers were able to improve on the software, take feedback, make it better, make it better, make it better, and then it became more intuitive, and that's the way they do it today.
Well, and you highlight the contrast in approach and culture between NASA and SpaceX, but there are several other contrasts that manifest itself in the book. So it's also SpaceX with how Blue Origin approached space exploration and their systems, how Boeing approached it. You had mentioned, I think in your previous book, a bit of Richard Branson and how Virgin approached it. So what were some of the things that you took away by looking at all of those different dimensions of that culture and approach, tension or difference?
Yeah, and so there's a culture and approach to the engineering, and I think SpaceX is obviously famous for build, test, fail, make it better, that sort of innovative culture. There's also, what I think is interesting, is sort of the business side of it. And SpaceX, from the very beginning, was eager to partner with NASA and the Pentagon to get government contracts, which not only brought in revenue, but allows them to sort of get a lot of information and tap the expertise from NASA engineers, from the Pentagon, from people who have been doing this for a long time. And I think they greatly benefited from that. When we talk about this culture clash, a lot of times it's framed as, SpaceX changing and disrupting the old, tired federal bureaucracy. But actually, in a lot of ways, it's the reverse as well, that NASA's teaching SpaceX, this is how you do stuff, because there's enormous amount of heritage there. Blue Origin initially sat out a lot of those government contract competitions. They were early on in the commercial crew program, but didn't really follow it through, didn't do the cargo program. And I think, I know that some leaders at the company, I think, looked back and thought that was a mistake. And so what you see at the beginning of this book is Jeff Bezos saying, and as the new Trump administration's coming in, that's it. We're going to compete. We're going after everything SpaceX goes after, whatever the big NASA programs are, we're going to be right there competing. And you sort of see that throughout the narrative.
So on that, give us a bit of the origin story here on how the Artemis program came to be and the Artemis Accords. I thought you document that very interesting, as well as a bit of the movement of dates here in addition to that.
Yeah, so it was very clear that when the Trump administration was coming in, Trump 1.0, that they wanted to return to the moon. I mean, under Obama, there was this journey to Mars, there was an asteroid redirect mission, go capture an asteroid. I think it was, did not have a lot of support within the space community. As I quoted someone in the book as saying, there's an asteroid at I think it's the Museum of Natural History in New York City. You can go see an asteroid for the cost of a subway fare. We don't need to go out into space necessarily to do that. The moon is the logical destination, and it had real momentum to do that. But, people ask all the time, like, we went to the moon in 1969, Apollo era, but we haven't been able to be back since. Why is that? And I think one of the main reasons has nothing to do with NASA or rocket technology. It has to do with politics. And the fact that, one presidential administration comes in and says, we're going to Mars, another one says, no, we're going to the moon, and NASA gets pointed away in so many different directions. So one of the key successes of the Artemis program was not just the founding of it and creating a clear direction, but building a structure and an apparatus and enough ties to make it endure. And it became the first human exploration deep space program to survive subsequent presidential administrations since the Apollo era, which was extraordinary. And the Artemis Accords, this idea that you get other countries to sign on working with the State Department, and now there are more than 35, 40 countries that have signed on, that they are bought in as well. So it makes it harder for any subsequent presidential administration to break those ties. You're not just affecting the United States program, you're affecting an international program.
Well, and we'll be able to ask this question of Scott and Chirag once they come up too, as well. But there were several motivations for Artemis Accords that you highlight. So one was the international coalition, but there were other pieces to this as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the political ones, but there's, and I mean, the Artemis Accords also set out sort of trying to create norms of behavior in space, rules of the road. This is how we behave. If you make a scientific discovery, you share it. You tell the world what you're doing in space. You talk about where you're going. And so it has to do with transparency, which obviously is designed to put pressure on China and other countries that may not want to play by those rules. And it does create, sort of a set of a team, as it were, allies. Like during the Cold War space race in Apollo, it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union, us for them. You know, it's like Commanders versus the Giants. But now you've got these massive teams with all these countries together. And you know, as Scott Pace, you know, said to me, and it's one of the quotes that really resonates, the Artemis program is not a military program. But that doesn't mean it's not a national security program.
Right, that's very well said. You know, the other thing that I think is interesting as well, and you highlight this, as you're talking through the evolution of NASA and just the political shift in priorities. Is it asteroid? Is it moon? Is it Mars? But, you know, it's as if you're raising this fundamental question. I mean, what is the reason for our space program? How do you bring back the inspiration that we had in decades past around space? So, you know, how do you answer that question?
It's a great question. I mean, there's so many things to it. I think the inspiration and optimism and national prestige and, you know, the pride that we saw during Apollo is part of it. But I would also say that's only a part of it. You know, now when we go back, there is, I think, this geopolitical aspect to it that is incredibly important. You know, General Hyten, when he first started talking about national security implications of space, he made it very clear. His quote was, "I'm not NASA." Right, that there are military aspects to space as well that go beyond the soft power and diplomatic aspects of space. I think the national security side of space is just so very important today. I think it's not well understood, certainly understood in this building, but not out in the general public. I actually remember Bill LaPlante on this stage, gosh, 10 years ago or so, saying that, he was like, remember Sputnik? He said, that was a little ball, a little satellite, all it did was beep. But the level of, do you just remember the paranoia and just the chaos that ensued from that? If the American public understood what was happening in space today, even the unclassified stuff, there should be that level of reaction to it. And then, of course, I mean, just the third part of it, and that's sort of the dark side of space, but there is the idea of, you know, discovery and science and figuring out the cosmos and where we came from and the Earth and the formation of the solar system and all of those questions. I mean, there's that analogy, like, you know, going out in the ocean for space exploration, we've only gone ankle deep, maybe up to our calves. I mean, you know, in terms of human spaceflight, there's a lot more to explore and to discover.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll bring up the other two, and we'll continue to go back and forth on this. But, you know, as you were putting together the various narratives in your book, this is going to be a good segue to them, were there pockets where you just had gaps? You're like, man, I really wish I knew what that inside story was. And then we'll ask them.
Yes, and I'm sure there are things that I missed, but one of the things I enjoy about this process in this book, because the narrative covers a period of time that I covered as a journalist for the Washington Post. So I'm going over stuff, you know, that I covered at the time, even though it was, you know, 10 years ago or so, or 5 years ago. And so I would do these interviews, and I would have my Washington Post hat on and talk about, all right, tell me what's going on right now. Right? I'm a newspaper reporter. I need to write a story for tomorrow. What's happening? And I'd get this, yeah, can't talk about that. Yeah, can't talk about that. Well, there's a little bit about this, but that's all I can say about it. Okay. Washington Post hat off, author hat on. 10 years ago, do you remember that meeting or that thing? And I'd get this, oh, you're not going to believe. You're not going to believe this story. Hold on, let me tell you about that. So it's rewarding to be back, you know, to be an author and to go back and to tell that history after time has passed. People feel more comfortable. They're in maybe a different spot or no longer at company A or company B or no longer with whatever agency they were with and are freer to talk and to tell and wanting, and I'm grateful for this, to have a documented history of it. I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about is when you talk about the privatization of space, you know, NASA, it gets a lot of criticism for its outreach, but, you know, it's got to be open and transparent. There's an archives, there's a history department. And, you know, is SpaceX and Blue Origin and all these companies keeping that history? Are they holding on to it too tight? So I'm glad to be able to try to tell these histories because I do think it's important.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead, take a quick minute here. I want to invite Dr. Scott Pace and Chirag Parikh up to the stage, and then we'll dive into some of these issues in greater depth.
Dr. Pace.
So Dr. Scott Pace, of the reinstated National Space Council, the first executive secretary, and then currently longtime director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. And then Chirag recently left the White House as the second modern executive director of the Space Council, and has established an organization, president of the Indutara Space LLC. So I wanted to highlight that. So for both of you, I actually want to pick up where I left off with Chris, which is really the raison d'etre for our space program, and that the central theme of this book is competitions in space. And it underscored this near decade where we did not have an American human spaceflight capability from American soil. So I'm curious, from both your perspectives, have our motivations for why we go to space changed? What's our raison d'etre today?
Okay. I think one of the things that I want to, teaching in class a lot, is about the political reasons for why we have a human spaceflight program. And I think you have to separate the human spaceflight program away from commercial, scientific, and military reasons, which have their own reasons for doing them. And so the real question then is like, what about human spaceflight? Why are we doing that? And what a lot of space, enthusiasts, even if they know history, don't realize is that the reason we did Apollo program in the first point was because of a form of geopolitical competition. The reason we did the space station was also part of geopolitical competition. Apollo-Soyuz, geopolitical competition, bringing the Russians into the space station, geopolitical competition. So for human spaceflight, you have to look at what is the sort of larger political context for them. And I think if you look at the prior efforts for doing Moon, Mars, Journey to Mars, other kinds of things out there, among the reasons why they failed or made only varying progress is they weren't really tied to enduring national interests and had a larger geopolitical reason. I think one of the reasons why Artemis, I'm hopeful, has made progress, and I think will continue to make progress, is because it is tied to a realization of a larger U.S. interest. We recognize today that space is much more globalized, many more countries involved. It's much more democratized in terms of the numbers of universities, private companies, all kinds of more people playing in it. And so when SPD-1 was issued, on one hand it said, okay, Moon versus Moon, then Mars, which is, a physically logical way to go. But it also said with commercial and international partners, which recognize that very changed environment, very different than what we were in Apollo. So the competition is there in the particular case with China especially, but the reasons for it is trying to have the U.S. exert influence and protect its interests in space. And we don't really, can't put a fence around it, we can't claim it as territory yet. So how do we protect our interests in space? Well, it's by having partnerships with industry, with internationals, to shape that environment. And that's what human spaceflight is doing. And I don't think it's been until recent years, even the last decade or so, decade and a half, where the realization of what globalization and democratization means and what the right response is. The right response in the Cold War era was to race the Soviets. Mm-hmm. The right response in this environment, I believe, is Artemis.
Well, and there are several different races going on: the military race, the commercial race, the China race. Chirag, how do you see this?
Yeah, I think the race has become very multifaceted at this point. I think you think about where we were in Apollo, and often, I think Apollo is just such a singular moment in the history of the United States and of the space era, and there's so many things that had to be perfect for that to have been successful. And as you look at that, whether it's about presidential priority, it's about budget, congressional interest, public interest, it doesn't exist. But now what we see, particularly as Scott's referencing the past decade and a half, is You know, you have this increased commercialization of space, this increased internationalization of space. You have this meteoric rise of, you know, China now coming up, and not just China from an Apollo level, we're going to the moon competition, but economic security, geopolitical leverage, as well as, of course, all the things about national security as well. And so it is far more complex along the way. When we think about Apollo, it went from like prestige and national power to the exploration element, which is more of curiosity, to now all the things that whether we in this room know or take for granted about the capabilities that space, whether in cislunar or on the ground, down to our economy, provide. It's created space to be more of a strategic domain, more than strategic as, you know, Stratcom aficionados would like to think about of nuclear doctrine, but more about, hey, this has ties to our economy, to our geopolitics, to our national security, to public health and services. When you think about some of the really deeply integrated things that GPS and other programs have along the way. And so that's why it's a really hard comparison for anybody like me to make between Apollo in of itself and anything else that's going on around these days.
Well, and race, I know, Scott, you've talked about this before, but
I hate that term.
yeah, I mean, is it a race? I mean, is it that implies that someone's going to cross
I blame
the finish
journalists
line?
who need an easy hook to talk about what's going on.
That's right.
You know.
Well, I'm here to sell books.
Okay, so there's a race. So the difference is, you know, a race has a beginning and an end, and we kind of, you know, figure out what the terms are. This is a long-term enduring struggle, okay, because we have very different value systems that are at stake. Ultimately, I would argue in the case of China, it's really a struggle for the future of the international order, and then what kind of values will prevail and be part of the space domain, which is critical to us. The analogy I like to think about is, or make, is that of Antarctica. Antarctica is a big continent, it's important. We have an Antarctic treaty system there that governs that particular outcome, that particular area. I don't know that will hold in space, but we have an Antarctic treaty system. And so while we honor, you know, the first Norwegian explorers, we don't really think that because Norway was there first, they have some, you know, special place in the system. They're part of the system now. But what makes the Antarctic Treaty System work, in part, is the United States and its friends and allies. And we put 3,000 people on the ice every summer. And we have controls and influences over logistics, power, communications, what goes in. China is there. China is absolutely on the Antarctic. They have bases and research bases, and they're welcome and part of the Antarctic Treaty System. But because of the sustainable presence that we have there, we're able to drive those kind of norms of behavior. We're able to really shape what that environment looks like. So it's not a matter of being first or even having the most technical advancement. It's that presence of showing up. The rules are made, as you know, by people who show up, not by people who stay behind. And so if we want to shape that space environment, we need to have the sustainable, routine access and figure out what that environment is going to be for. Maybe there's a commercial future on the moon, maybe not. If there's not, then we move on toward exploring and doing other things that government does. If there is a commercial future, we find a way for how does that transition over more to the private sector over time, just as we're trying to transition, you know, the LEO environment. But the thing that's different today than the past is the realization of the importance of sustainability and presence and values that shape that environment rather than a singular race. But again, I don't expect journalists will give up using that term.
Well, actually, I love your term, long-term enduring struggle. That's good. I'm going to use that, so thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I've taken that. Maybe a little bit hard to fit on the book cover, but I will note, actually, the last line of the Space Barons, the last book, the last line is, and I know I'm not ruining it because everybody hasn't read it, so I'll go ahead and say it, is something about a race that had no finish line. And so that I do try to hit that note, but I do agree with everything you said. Yes.
But I think, sorry, Kari,
go ahead.
this is where it goes off rails. I think.
Yeah.
So, but I think this is kind of where, you know, the race is no longer that footprint, and there's far too many people who fall into that trap because it's clickbait or something like that. Clearly not your articles, of course. Yes, but it's soft power perception management that occurs. Hey, if they can get there, and they have these other capabilities. Maybe we want to partner with them. And maybe we don't partner with them on the space thing, and maybe we have a little token thing that goes around the moon and back, but maybe we can partner them on a different industry. And it's one of these things where it's just one straw after another straw after another straw. And suddenly you realize you've developed this deep entanglement. And I do believe over the past 40, 50 plus years now, that's the model the United States has been very successful at, is being able to show technical prowess, commercial prowess, geopolitical savvy, to be able to say, hey, come along with us on this ride, but it's going to have all these additional benefits that may or may not be tangentially related to this big one as well. And to me, that's the bigger concern, is being able, not what that next footprint would be, is how, what's in the wake of that type of event.
Well, and to have that sustainability and continuity, it requires support across successive administrations. It requires bipartisan support. And Chris, you talk about this in the book, and in decades past, there's been a lot of whiplash. Each administration comes in and changes their objectives with regard to space human exploration. But you have this great analogy where you invoke peanuts, and Charlie Brown gets ready to go kick the football, and right as he's about ready to kick, Lucy takes it from him. But can I maybe have you talk a little bit about that continuity piece? And then Scott and Chirag, I mean, you both came in with transition teams and saw the substance as well as the politics. I mean, was there any risk with each of these administrations of shifting course? And how did we get to that point for now of a degree of continuity?
Yeah, so Jim Bridenstine, who was a NASA administrator during the first Trump administration, was so nervous when President Biden won the election and coming in, because he did not know if his program, Artemis, was going to endure. And behind the scenes, as we document in the book, there was this effort involving people on both sides of the aisle. Mike Gold, who had served in NASA during the Trump administration, meeting with Bahavia Lal, who was on the Biden transition team, to try to preserve the Artemis program because of its geopolitical importance, and actually got Jake Sullivan, who is Biden's national security advisor, to come to NASA headquarters with some of his staff and talk to him about the importance of Artemis, because President Biden, during the campaign, had said nothing about it and didn't know. And it wasn't until very early on in the administration that Kristen Fisher, then covering the White House for Fox News, asked Biden's press secretary, Jen Psaki, hey, what about Artemis? Are you going to keep it? And famously, Jen Psaki didn't know. And she had to go back and sort of asked, like, what's this Artemis program? Are we going to do this? And then came back like the next day or the day after and was like, oh, 100%. We're going to keep this program and have this continuity and not be a Lucy in the football one more time. But behind the scenes, there was all kinds of work and activity that went into preserving that.
Okay, so what was happening behind the scenes?
Well, if I would say behind the scenes, say in 2016.
Yes.
I mean, one of the very first questions that then candidate President Trump had was about space. And his first reaction was, we have a lot of potholes in New York City to fill. I mean, it was the first reaction was not really one of space. But former Congressman Bob Walker, Newt Gingrich, and others, worked really hard about linking this to the larger image of making America great, and how this would link into economic and military and diplomatic imagery of the United States, and it quickly made that connection. And so I think that push toward making space part of an issue as a sort of a signature event really helped a lot there in the 2016. When the transition for 2020, everything that Christian says is absolutely true, and I find a particular positive irony in Kristen Fisher asking that question, because those of you know that her mother was Anna Fisher, who flew in the early 80s and was listed as the first mother in space and that sort of thing, and so that her daughter is the one who's on deck, to ask that question. And when the press secretary responded positively, myself and lots of others were all just cheering because we recognize how monumental that was, that kind of transition, all that work. And so when she asked that question and it was that positive connection, that's exactly what a lot of us have been working for for a long time, and very grateful for that transition.
It's fascinating that there are two things that survive, two sort of key issues that survive from Trump 1.0 to Biden: the Artemis program and the Space Force.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's sort of, and I think the reason for that is because both of these things are aligned with larger enduring national interests. And you have to have that kind of alignment so that a new team can come in and say, yes, the previous political team, they obviously, didn't know what they were doing. But this thing here, is okay, and we want to make sure we're part of that. And I think you can see a couple other things. I think the commercial space interests, the concern about competition with China, if I might throw in, I think some of the stuff happening in space nuclear power, which recently is one of those things where there's a larger theme that's going to be continuing in the competition.
So Chirag, was there a risk when the Biden team came in that there would be a change again?
Well, I'll first take a step back before going to that, which is, I went, before there was a Space Council 2.0, then a 3.0, right? Like there was, it was basically pretty much one poor soul at the National Security Council and one poor soul at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And yea, verily, I was the one on the National Security Council side. So I came in about September of 2010. So that was after the Obama policy was written. That's where the determination was made. Stories behind that as well about going, to an asteroid. The famous quote that you used in your book, of course, Chris, about well, we've already been to the moon, and so on and so forth. So, so that was certainly a change. But when you look at the continuity of maybe not destination, but of capability, you see it a little bit differently. Under Mike Griffin and Bush, you had the inception of commercial launch services and commercial cargo programs. Under Obama, you had commercial crew, but also you had the development of the Constellation program, where that kept capability, and as we all know, politically, the workforce, right? The Ares 5 evolved to the SLS, which brought in the Orion capsule, which brought in the European service module. All that stuff happened, during the Obama administration. That was then picked up and then moved with an addition of Gateway under Trump 1.0. And so there is this natural course of evolution, and I don't really see this too much as whiplash, as it is if you look at it a few veneers down, it is a natural evolution of where we've come along the way. And that's why I think when we came into to the White House under Biden, I think there was natural understanding, and yours truly believe that yes, we needed to do Moon. It's the logical sense. It enables for commercial partnerships. And I think, a lot of what was discussed, at, Space Council meetings, public narratives was about the strategic competition with China, inarguably so. But I think what it laid the opportunity space for us was to broaden the reason of why space. And it allowed us to do strategic cooperation, right? Allow us to go to countries that have not been part of this, to the Emiratis, and say, hey, do you want to build an airlock for Gateway? To talk to all these other countries that want to be not just part of the Artemis Accords, but a part of the Artemis program. But it wasn't just human spaceflight either. We needed, from a public perspective, to broaden the why elsewhere too. So you think about climate, right? Certainly there's a lot of discussions about Earth observation systems, the funding challenges. But a fact that often gets overlooked is that there's 7.5 million users of NASA data, climate data. 75% of those users are from .coms, and 75, and it's easy to remember these numbers because they're all 7 and 5, but and then 75 out of the Fortune 100 companies use it. A lot of this data is actually the guts to provide economic principles for companies and corporations, not just in the United States, but around the world. So we looked at that, and then another thing that we did was we invested some small money to assess the health of the economy. And so hey, this isn't just a prestige thing, it's not just a geopolitical thing, but there's just a report that just came out a couple months ago. The US space economy, the commercial space economy, is $240 billion of gross economic output. Is that a lot? Is that a little? I don't know. But here's the good thing. This wasn't done by space people. This is done by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. These are a bunch of statisticians and economists. And they don't measure just space, but they measure electric vehicle industry, healthcare, travel, tourism, you name it. 20 or so different categories, and space was one of them. It's 0.6% of the GDP. Again, is that a little or is that a lot? Turns out agriculture in your head, what do you think how much percentage of the US economy is agriculture? It's 0.9%. And we're talking about the potential of tripling the global space economy within the next 5 to 10 years. So we wanted to really frame it in that way, and that really sparked more motivation, not just for international partnerships, but for commercial partnerships and to modernize capabilities and so on and so forth.
Well, so now I want to dive into those two areas that we've had continuity on, as you said, Chris, both Artemis, the Artemis program, Artemis Accords, and then Space Force as well. So I'll start with Artemis, and we'll bring it to the now. But yeah, there's a great passage in there, Chris, that you highlight where, then Administrator Bridenstine wanted to get this line into Pence's National Space Council meeting remarks, and then I think you wanted to get it, Scott, into the State of the Union address, but it was, we need American astronauts flying on American rockets from American soil. But then once the president got hold of it, he said, hey, 2028, that's not good enough. We need to accelerate that to 2024. So maybe you can give us a little bit of insight on what you saw going on. But then, Scott, you were in the middle of this. Could we do it? And then, where are we with the Artemis program today? And we still have some very ambitious timelines. Artemis 2 next year, Artemis 3, 2027. We've heard that there are issues with some of the providers that would take us there. China has said they want to get to the moon by 2030. So where do you think we're at in the trajectory that we're on?
So there are two great stories about that. The first one is in the State of the Union, President Trump did say, we're going to fly American astronauts on American rockets from American soil, except he said this year. He added that, and that was in 2019, and Jim Bridenstine's looking at that going, uh-oh, I'm now on the clock. And seeing, the rate at which, political appointees were falling by the wayside, he suddenly felt a fair amount of pressure there. But then, right, exactly, NASA's goal to go back to the moon, they had this direction, but they were thinking internally 2028 is a reasonable goal. Trump, wanting to capitalize on that, was pushing to do it faster, 2024. And Vice President Pence embraced that. I think a lot of people looked at that skeptically, to put it mildly. But I think there was a benefit to it in that it did light a fire and it did give a goal, and it had a sense of urgency. Even if people knew it was a fiction, there was like, let's get after it. Let's try to shake things up and do it. And by the way, Vice President Pence, Bill Nelson was NASA administrator, also frequently used the race line. Actually, acting NASA administrator Sean Duffy does as well. So you hear it from the top forms of government. But I think where we are today to bring it forward is, landing on the moon, returning astronauts to the moon, even by 2028, may seem optimistic where we are right now, given the current state of affairs.
Where do you think we're going?
So I think that certainly the movement from 2028, which had been kind of the internal planning number, to 2024, was certainly a surprise to the system. But there was an intentionality about it. And one of the things that you got out of it is when you pulled something up that close, and you said, no, seriously, 2024, then you started to see really where the pinch points were. You'd start to see some clarity. Oh, we can't do that. Well, why? Well, we're missing this part, or we're missing this test. Oh, now we're having a clarity. One of the dangers with really long-term goals, like landing on Mars by the 2030s or something like that, is once you go home early on Friday, what's the difference? It's it's in the 2030s. Whereas if you have something that's really, really near term and you have that sense of urgency and drive, and by the way, you see SpaceX do that all the time. I love their line about we turn the impossible into the merely late. Which does have that sense of drive and urgency in it. So that was a benefit, I think, to the system. If we look at things today, I would say there's probably three big areas to worry about. One of the areas not to worry about actually is the policy. Now, I'm really arrogant here and thinking there really doesn't need to be any major policy updates. We kind of took care of a lot of that in Trump 1. Thank you very much. Okay, so the challenge today is really implementation. How well do you do this and execute? There's some policy issues I think, still around. I won't deny that. But again, the major movements are not in policy and implementation. And the three big implementation area is the transition to LEO commercialization. So what do we do about the commercial LEO development program, that transition, because ISS end of life is coming up maybe sooner than people think. Second big one, I think I've testified on this earlier this year about the need to have multiple options for heavy lift and for getting to the moon. You want to put 15 metric tons on the lunar surface, you need about 45 metric tons in translunar injection. There's a number of ways you can get there. And I think, and a singular system like SLS has a problem. One, it's a singular system, and NASA knows dissimilar redundancy is good. Second problem is it doesn't produce enough. 12, 18 months, that doesn't give you that kind of sustainable access. Never mind the price. It doesn't give you that kind of sustainable access. You want more ways of getting there. In the recent memo between OMB and OSTP on R&D priorities, if you read the section between Russ Vought and Michael Kratsios, direction to agencies, you read the section on space, it talks about things like payload aggregation, aggregating payloads in LEO. There's a lot of different other ways of getting, that 45 metric tons into TLI. And there are opportunities with New Glenn, certainly with Starship, even Vulcan with a Centaur upper stage of getting there. So we can start creating some more opportunity for more sustainable access. And the third one, which most people have been focusing on, is, of course, the HLS program. And more efforts for test flights, demoing it, before we put, humans on it, maybe having other alternatives. That's certainly an opening, and that's maybe an opening that Blue Origin is going to want to take a look at. But those are not policy questions. Those are three big major programmatic management questions that I think are probably occupying the new team at NASA, as we speak.
So Chirag, put your engineering hat on here too. I mean, what's a realist perspective?
It's kind of fun. It's kind of funny, right? Because almost from the inception of the announcement, it's been kind of 2028 on the internal side of things here, and I do have faith in SpaceX and being able to prove these capabilities. It's extremely complicated, and I believe that they'll be capable. I think everybody's more focused on the timing because of the China strategic competition or race, if you want to use that terminology along the way. But ultimately, one, and I think this is the great thing about, my friend Scott here, is he and I probably agree on far more things than most people know. But, and so, yes, we do need to have redundant capabilities. I think, Chris, you put even in the book when you're talking to Pam Melroy, and she just kind of on the side says, I would have maybe done the HLS acquisition a little bit differently. The acquisition decision came during Biden, but it came about a month or so before Bill Nelson was actually confirmed. And so that was a weird way when you knew he was en route to then make a significant acquisition decision along the way. And while the stories weren't really articulated, there was a number of discussions that occurred in the winter of 2021 about how do we make a second HLS acquisition occur? How do we do this with additional resources? Part of that conversation also transformed into lunar surface architecture, which manifested a couple years later in some of our Moon to Mars objectives as well. But it was a lot of credit to some of the folks on our team, to some staff at OMB, and to NASA leadership, to be quite honest, to come up with a creative solution to get the second HLS lander by giving SpaceX 2, Blue the third one, and then compete for a sustainable lander after that. And I think that's really what's going to make us successful is, to Scott's point, the programmatics, but also, and this is extremely boring to almost anybody except in this town, is the contracting vehicles and mechanisms to make some of these things a reality.
Right. Okay, the other point of continuity, you mentioned Space Force. And Chirag, I'm going to start with you this time because last winter we hosted a 5th anniversary of the establishment of the Space Force. And I had wanted you to come talk about the origin story, but you had to go visit NASA Johnson at the time. So I'll give you a little bit of reprieve. But I want to give you an opportunity as well. Talk a little bit about the behind-the-scenes atmospherics during, whether it was during your tenure at NSC at the time, and the what you saw and the role that you played. But take us now to the present day. Where does Space Force need to go from here? And this has actually been in the news this morning. How do you see that nexus between national security and NASA and the commercial space sector?
That's like 4
So
questions.
it's a lot.
Yeah.
Go where you want to go with it.
Well, look, again, for those that are, historical wonks of national security space organization and management, You know, this can date back decades ago. You can go back as, you know, to the Rumsfeld Commission in 2001. You know, and I think if you think about organization and management, I think you can classify them into 3 different categories. They're good ideas that never got executed. Some of these happened maybe way back during the Reagan years, and a great study is the Allard Commission from like 2008 or 2009. Never got implemented. The Allard Commission was commissioned because the Rumsfeld Commission on the organization of DoD space in 2001 actually did get some execution along the way and had some good momentum, but then it petered away. So you got things that don't get executed, things that get executed, but then, you know, eventually evolve away. And then I think really it is the credit of multiple administrations and the better part of 6 years, probably 7 years of work where a threat assessment comes into the White House. In this case, President Obama says, what are we doing about this? We run a number, dozens, probably in the 40 or 50 category interagency meetings over about a 1.5 year period. We find the money, multiple billions of dollars to be able to say, hey, here's how we do space security. My good friend and partner at the White House 2 times over, Matt O'Kane, says, hey, the best way to do this is to be able to have somebody who can control this money and to create an organizational structure around it. We gave DoD the opportunity to determine their own fate about how to organize this. This is all stuff, by the way, this is all pre-Congress, right? That's where most of the public story begins, is when Congressman Rogers, yeah, you worked with Rogers and Cooper come into play. Let's just say a lot of material was then shared at that point when we kind of got to the end of the Obama administration, say, hey, you know, this is something that needs to be done. And so Matt was the continuity who worked with the transition team, and then ultimately when Scott came on board and the National Security Council team came on board to be able to say, hey, this is still important. The funding now exists along the way. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot more story to be written about that kind of stuff. But fast forwarding to now, when I came back into the office, I was very excited to see, hey, where did all these investments that we could put went? And surprisingly so, they went very well. Not much are publicly articulated, and many of them are classified, as you'd imagine. But then you see things like the Space Development Agency manifest, where you have a resilient architecture. You see NRO and SDA both now utilizing commercial buses and, you know, through different partnerships and programs. It might not just be services, buying pixels, but like, hey, can I buy components along the way? And so really where Space Force is transforming now is to be able to develop capabilities to use some of these investments that we've had, what's called the tactics, techniques, and procedures along the way. And now you see other foreign governments saying, hey, we need to have organizations like that. We need to see other governments saying we need to have resiliency. And that's brought a huge amount of international partnerships along the way. It's one of the central themes I think we had during the Space Council, was a lot of international partnerships. But ultimately, it gets down to money, right? And so when we came in, Space Force's budget was significantly increasing, probably like $4 or $5 billion just in Scott's timeframe. Then the 21 budget was $15 billion for Space Force. And the 2024 budget, I believe 23 or 24 budget was $30 billion. And now with the Triple B legislation, they're getting more money for Golden Dome. And I won't be surprised or shocked at all if Space Force's budget doubles. It absolutely needs more money because, as I think most people in this room understand, it underpins not just our ability to fight and defend in space, but it also is the linkage to our air, land, and sea forces from a ISR, SATCOM, and position navigation and timing perspective. And so you have that challenge against entities like China, who've not slowed down at all, if anything increased because of what they're seeing Space Force doing. And then, again, whole other panel someday in the future maybe. Then you got this little thing called a Russian nuclear weapon in space. That becomes a challenge in and of itself, which I know Chris had a little bit of an anecdote in his book about. So it continues, bottom line is it continues to underlie the importance of Space Force in a way that, I agree, the public just does not understand.
Scott, you were key in this as well. Where does it go from here?
Well,
Where do you see what should their focus be?
so I think one of the things that is interesting, we had a kind of a dinner event with retired Congressman Jim Cooper, and a lot of the people who are involved in the Space Force and stuff. And people went around and telling stories about where they were in different parts. And I think this is maybe another book, yet to be written. But what was striking about it is there was work kind of done kind of pre-game, game day, stuff that happened on the Hill, stuff that happened in industry and so forth. And as people told their different stories, you know, one you'd think, you know, blind men and the elephant story, everybody, you know, having a different part of it. But the other was, it was like a relay race. Not planned maybe from the beginning quite this way, but it was really striking how people would come on stage for a particular period of time, do their thing, do it well, and then hand it off. Something would happen in the setup. Something happened. Matt was one of the key authors behind an OMB study on different options for the future of organizing for space, what became Space Force. Well, you know, my basement is full of studies on organizing, you know, for space. Integrating air and space was a topic that, you know, bedeviled people for, you know, decades. Yet the threat had now changed to a point where, you know, you couldn't just let it run. You needed to, you know, pick something. And so there were options that were then set up. And then we had those discussions with the Hill. And then they had legislation that moved on. And I think it was, again, very fascinating because there was agreement on the threat. There was agreement that we needed to organize for this differently. And we had different parts of the government each playing, you know, a kind of a role in, not quite a symphony, but certainly an organized improvisation that led to, I think, a very, very good result. I think where we're going from now is, as with the civil side and the Artemis program, just as I might say that you know, Artemis has a national security aspect to it, if not a military aspect, the military side has diplomatic and commercial implications in terms of what we do. And so thinking about how we're going to operate, how we're going to work with the private sector, it can't be like some of these traditional, you know, DoD programs, programs of record, large industrial base. It needs to be a lot more faster, a lot more agile. And this has implications for how we work with industry. This is not something where the U.S. alone can do all this. For Golden Dome to work, and whatever set of assumptions you want to make, allies are going to be an integral, you know, sort of part of that. So the same sort of geopolitical conditions that shaped Artemis are also ones, globalization, democratization, are also shaping and will shape what the future of the Space Force looks like.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think to the credit of Space Force, I think they became kind of like the, you know, the intellectual leads in space policy at the Pentagon over the past several years. And, you know, some of the things that we worked very closely with them and they pressed out is the commercial integration strategy, as well as recently they just put out their international integration strategy as well. So they know how to do it, right? And strategies, as most people know, are ends, ways, and means. We know what we want. We want partnerships. We want commercial. We want integration. Here's the strategies and how we're going to do it. And so now the real key is, it's actually simple, but it's very hard, is how do you get the investments to change that? And then similarly, how do you change the culture of an acquisition and an operation workforce to be able to do those things?
So that's, I'm going to jump in here because I want to start bundling a few questions from the audience on this topic of commercial and back to the space barons. You know, we have a lot to be thankful for. These are very wealthy men that are space nerds, you know, are true believers in going to the moon and human exploration of the cosmos, and are willing to put their own fortunes into it. But to what degree are they truly, you know, focused on national security as well? And we are now putting a lot of stock on these individuals and their whims to, you know, achieve national security and national interest objectives. So I'm going to, you know, Chris, from your perspective, and you had great access to these individuals. You know, how did you see them view U.S. leadership in space? How do they look at national security? You know, are you concerned about their, say, outsized role in national security? But also teasing a bit more on for Scott and Chirag, you know, that tension between here's how we've done things. You have these upstart, you know, companies that are doing things very differently. How did those tensions manifest themselves in terms of what you saw, the policy deliberations that you were involved in, the investment, the program decisions? And then we have a question in here from Marshall Smith. It's great to see you. Is, you know, we'll say, should NASA, but more broadly the government and the country, accept more risk if we're going to beat China? So a lot there to unpack.
Well, I would say in terms of the commercial sector and, alignment with the goals of the nation, that I think they are trying to position themselves in alignment with what NASA wants to do, what the Pentagon wants to do, but they also have an ulterior motive. That's to gain revenue, to win contracts, make money. They're companies, they're focused on the bottom line. The other thing that I'd say is that it's, I think, an increasing concern within the government, again, civil, military side, and just with the space community writ large, is that so much of the nation's space enterprise is in the hands of one company, SpaceX. And that's not to criticize SpaceX, or, they're in a way a victim of their own success, but the competition isn't quite there yet. I mean, Blue Origin has flown their New Glenn orbital rocket one time. We're seeing the emergence of more companies, but nobody's really challenged them. And I think the government is, I know the government is desperate for more providers, to have more access, because we saw, for example, an extreme example of this when there was the Elon Musk, Donald Trump breakup, and Elon, publicly threatened to take away Dragon from NASA, which is the only way NASA can get its astronauts to the International Space Station, which was, I think, sent out in anger, and it was quickly rescinded, but it sent shockwaves through the government, and it highlights that tension of having so much in the hands of so few.
I think the government has a fundamental challenge here, is it needs to have a certain amount of intellectual capacity inside the government. So being really dependent on outside sources and not being able to do anything about that, or having no ability to replicate that, that's kind of their own fault. That's not something I can sort of blame the companies for. So it's like when we had losses of launch vehicles in the 80s, the DoD went on a great effort for assured access to space, and trying a number of different ways of making sure there would be assured access to space. The importance of dissimilar redundancy was driving a lot of sort of NASA thinking, certainly in the aftermath of sort of Columbia. So the challenge here is not, gee, these companies are so powerful, I'm uncomfortable with that, how can I go restrict them? Which I think would be kind of like the wrong response. But more like, I need more options, I need more diversity in this, I need more alternatives. What can I do to go about creating that? And in extremis, the government can theoretically do it itself. I'm not saying this is really maybe the right answer, but in the response to like the HLS problem, well, we built a biprop 2-stage 15 metric ton lunar lander in less than 70 months the first time. But that was a government-directed program of record. This is not the environment that's conducive to programs of record starting, but, kind of can be done. So judging how important is it to land on the moon before, China returns. I think they're absolutely dead serious about it, so I take the Chinese schedules very seriously. So it's a political question about how serious this is for you, and you can go at it a number of different ways.
With 4% of the economy.
4.4% of the discretionary budget, 1.1% of GDP, but it's only 1 year.
Yeah.
So
Please give NASA DoD's budget for 1 year. I think is what I just heard you say.
Well,
okay.
I'll say it even more. Back, in Trump 1, one of my goals was to try to get the NASA budget back in real dollar terms to where it was in fiscal year 92 at the end of the Cold War. By the way, when my predecessor, Mark Albrecht, was the executive secretary of the Space Council. So 92 at the end of the Cold War, if we converted then year dollars for NASA to at then current year dollars, it'd be about $30 billion. And $24 is about 35. So I think a NASA budget of around $30 billion is not an unreasonable target. The problem is it's not about dollars alone. It's also about what do those dollars do. Right. So when the administration cut in the president's budget request, the 25% cut to the prior year enacted, and I saw what was cut, I'm kind of like not surprised at what was selected for cuts. And then when the Hill pushed back and said, no, here's $10 billion or $9.9 billion back, again, not surprised at all about that reaction. But the thing I'm still waiting to hear or waiting to see or would encourage is how, when you put this money back in, whether it's an additional 10 or more, is where are you going? You know, what is the future? And I think handling the CLD transition, heavy lift alternatives, dealing with the HLS, getting to a sustainable Artemis architecture that not only gets us through Artemis 2s and 3s, but really in a longer term way to meet our geopolitical requirement, that is still like left to be done. And so I think one of the current things sort of missing from discussion today is a realization of the geopolitical importance of the Artemis program in partnership with the Space Force going forward. So that's the debate we're probably still going to have.
Chirag, commercial.
For who? I mean, commercial writ large? I think it's absolutely critical. I think it's essential. I think it's not going anywhere we're not going anywhere without commercial at this point, right? And I think part of that is because now commercial sees opportunities. It's actually well crafted in the National Space Policy about the definition of commercial, where they have to take on risk themselves. Mm-hmm. They have to have a customer that's outside of the federal government. But I'd argue, and I'm happy to have this argument with anybody, that the U.S. government is effectively the underpinning for almost every space sector, maybe except SATCOM. Right? But I think now commercial is starting to get a toehold into these things. And so that's why we did put a lot of time, energy, and enthusiasm into something like commercial LEO destination. Surely there's a lot of geopolitical element to it. Surely there's a lot of our sister space agencies around the world who are, as we speak, gearing up for their budget discussions and saying, hey, do we partner with the United States on this thing? But this thing no longer will exist by 2030, and that was one of the things that we did, was extended the space station through 2030. Now, who do we partner with? And the answer is U.S. industry. And the way to partner sometimes with U.S. industry is to develop your own industry, to partner with U.S. industry, to provide those geopolitical benefits that were once purely within the domain of the government. That's on the civil side. Same thing on the national security side. Remote sensing, SATCOM, PNT, space launch. There's a healthy ecosystem out there. It's really going to depend upon how it's governed and how it's resourced.
Okay, I have two more questions here, and then we'll wrap up. If you had to pick one major failure or blind spot in U.S. space strategy over the last decade, what would it be?
Are you going to point at me and am I going to point at you? I'm kidding, no.
So jump ball here.
Jump ball, we can. A maybe less serious answer is one of the motivations for, I think, recreating the Space Council. And before in the 2016 election, I was asked, well, what do you think about a Space Council? And I said, well, I was the Commerce Department rep to the Space Council, in Bush 41, and I thought it was really useful because coming at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of dual-use issues that we never would have dealt with during the Cold War, but excess ballistic missiles, high-precision remote sensing, different roles for the private sector, international partnerships. And a Space Council was a great place to kind of have those sorts of discussions. So I was like, hey, that could be useful if the president wants to use it that way. Then I referenced to Chirag was saying, two overworked guys in the White House at the time. And said, whatever you do, don't do what they're doing, because they both as individuals, did a tremendous job, but from the outside, it was ridiculous. You needed about maybe 5 or 6 FTE. Maybe you could get by with a little bit less, but it certainly wasn't two guys. The issues that were around for civil, commercial, and national security were large enough. So I said, if you don't have a Space Council, for God's sakes, whatever you do, double or triple, the number of people, working on this thing, because the workload and the need is really gigantic. And I think that's still true today. There's a number of different ways to organize the interagency process. But I think that you have to recognize that space has this really unique way of bringing together multiple issues. And if you don't have a process somewhere that brings together those issues, things will still work, things will still happen, but it won't be as effective as if you have an integrated team, playing it, and which is more than two guys.
Any different answers, Chirag?
Well, I don't think that was really a failure question, really. But I think To me, look, I'll say the challenge is this, which is our ambitions are literally out of this world. The rhetoric is often out of this world as well. And the challenge that we face is whether or not we can apply the resources and coordinate, to Scott's point about Space Council, apply the resources and coordinate to be able to meet those ambitions. And yes, they have to be stretch goals, but we have motivated civil servants, we have motivated administrations, we have motivated industry, and we have motivated international partners who want to do the right thing. And right now, with a vacancy of narrative, it makes it very challenging to be able to put investments. And then secondly, there's one other motivated entity that I think post-Space Council life that I've really gotten to learn. It's not just the government and private and billionaires that are putting money in. There are large financial institutions like private equity firms, venture capital firms, who very much, even with all the ups and downs and the starts and stops of space, are very, very interested in being able to put investments into this great industry that we all participate in along the way. And so being able to provide that level of assuredness from a strategy and policy perspective to gain those resources, to meet that rhetoric, to meet those ambitions is hard because there's so many diffuse goals. There's so many different initiatives and motivations, and the nature of will in and of itself has changed since Apollo, and so therefore we have to think differently about how to date.
Okay, so we're going to end on this. We're going to put Chris in the hot seat. He is usually calling you and peppering you both for information. We get a chance to now turn the tables on the journalist.
Everyone's favorite parody. Yeah.
Scott and Chirag, are there any questions that you want to pump Chris for information on? And we'll end there and put you in the hot seat and give you the last word.
Uh-oh.
So I'm curious, because I know this has happened with one of your competitor national newspapers. Did you ever have a situation where you had an editor or a colleague or something tell you, hey, here's a narrative we think is right or we want to push, go out and dig up some support for it?
Well, I would say yes and no. I mean, editors, I like to say, practice theoretical journalism, right? In theory, this would be a good story. And I was an editor for a while, too. And, I think I practice some theoretical journalism, too. I think I've always been given the freedom that, yes, you have an idea, maybe some direction, but then it's my job to go out and get the facts and sort of come back. And thankfully, I've always been given the freedom to come back and say, all right, well, actually, the story is slightly different. Or in some cases, actually, it's the reverse of what we thought, and then getting full support from my editors. And I think that's what the process is. And I think even as a journalist, sometimes you go in with an idea of what the story is, and then, your best laid plans never survive the first brush of combat. Once you actually start doing the reporting, it's really important to remain nimble and intellectually curious and free to sort of see like, no, I have to adapt my hypothesis to sort of adhere to the facts. So I think that's a natural evolution of it. If you're getting into a point where there's some friction there and someone wants to adhere to something that fits a narrative, that's problematic. It's really problematic.
Yeah, not the comment in question. I think it's a fascinating thing to watch your journey where you have to report on your boss's ambitions and be fair about both the good and the bad and the ugly about those types of things. I think just your personal recollection of the challenges you have to go there. Maybe you had full freedom, but I think the question is this for me. It's not looking backwards, it's looking forward. It's as you start thinking about transitions and changes, like, do you see, books are great because it's a great accumulation of capability. Articles and web posts are great because it provides you that access. But, we live in an attention deficit disorder, attention-starved society, and trying to get the message out. Do you see a different way in which people such as yourselves and your colleagues need to be thinking about getting the word out about all this stuff that we've talked about and then some?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to address the Jeff Bezos thing, who owns the Washington Post, where I've worked for more than 25 years. Got no special treatment, didn't treat him any differently, so we approach him without fear or favor. There's some critical things written about Blue Origin and written about Jeff personally, but I think it's an accurate representation of that. Yeah, I mean, it's a weird time in the media. You're seeing disruption by the internet, by social media, all sorts of different avenues. It's becoming much more niche. People going to Substack and YouTube and influencers and doing really well. I still believe in the power of daily journalism, in the power of books. That I wrote this book, as I said at the very beginning, because it transcended what I could do in my day job. And I just think that being able to tell this history, there's still an audience for it, and people will want to read. I think people still look back and read the Space Barons as a work about the early days of the commercial space industry, and I hope that 10, 20 years from now, Rocket Dreams, people will be going back to that and saying this is where we were. And so I'm grateful to have the opportunity to write it and to talk about it at events like this.
So the third book, the first one was the stand-up of the commercial space industry and its rise. If this next one is really, you now have the dominance of some of these commercial space players like SpaceX, what does the next decade portend?
Well, so it's interesting. I had seen this as a trilogy, and the third book was moving from, as this book, you've sort of got this dominance in the commercial space sector is happening, but it's still sort of the covered wagon phase, and then the third book is moving into the homesteading phase, right? From exploration to expansion to holding the territory. And as I was talking about that theory with Mark Albrecht, the former head of the National Space Council, he goes, no. Before you get to the homesteading book, you need the cavalry. Got to write about the cavalry, Space Force, national security space. So that's one thing I'm thinking about.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank you all today for joining us. Scott and Chirag, I'm sorry. Genuinely, thank you for your service to the nation for so many years and for the leadership and corralling a lot of cats as part of your service on the National Space Council. Chris, you're absolutely right. You do all of us a service by capturing these stories, this history, the deep insights that you have, and just the trust that people place in you to do that accurately and objectively. And there are many young folks in the audience today too that I think I hope you read the book, because it's such a dynamic time, and I think you've captured that energy and dynamism well. And then just lastly, I want to thank our CSIS team here and our streaming and broadcasting team. For those here in the audience, Chris will do a book signing if you'd like a book, and we have some refreshments out in the foyer. So thanks everyone for joining us.